After the fall of the Third Reich and Adolf Hitler's suicide, the entire world focused on the crimes of the Nazi regime, but few asked what happened to his family, what happened to those who bore his blood. His sister Paula changed her surname to Wolf and lived in hiding in a modest house near Berchtesgaden, denying until the end that her brother was responsible for the Holocaust. His half-brother Alois tried to rebuild his life as a restaurateur, but his surname was a curse. And his nephew William Patrick, who once fought in the US Navy against the Nazi regime, went into exile in New York under another name, determined to erase any trace of his origins. What happened to his blood? Who were the last bearers of his name? Can one escape the weight of a cursed legacy? Hitler's early years, Adolf Hitler. A name that immediately conjures up images of war, destruction, and genocide. However, before becoming the architect of one of the most abominable regimes in modern history, Hitler was just another child of the vast and fragmented Austro-Hungarian Empire. His childhood, far from being marked by extreme poverty or neglect, unfolded in an environment of relative economic stability, albeit under family pressure that would decisively shape his character. Born on April 20th, 1889, in the small village of Braunau am Inn, near the German border, Adolf Hitler came into the world in an environment that still preserved the rural traditions of the 19th century. His family belonged to the lower middle class, with a secure standard of living thanks to his father's employment with the Imperial Customs Service, a respected institution that ensured a stable income and a certain social position. Adolf's father, Alois Hitler, was not an easy man. Authoritarian and stern, he represented the typical rigid paternal figure of the time. His personality, however, hid a double face. In public, he was seen as a polite and cordial man. At home, he exercised iron control over his family, using disciplinary methods that today would be considered abuse. In fact, as Adolf's sister, Paula Hitler, recounted years later, her brother was often the favorite target of their father's wrath, receiving almost daily beatings due to his stubbornness and rebellious nature. The now infamous surname Hitler was not originally his surname. His father's real surname was Schicklgruber. At the age of 39, Alois applied to adopt his stepfather's surname, Johann Georg Hitler, a process that involved an uncertain spelling change and transformed it into Hitler. The true reason for this change remains a historical mystery, although some suggest that it was an attempt to present himself as a more respectable man or simply to make pronunciation easier. Adolf's mother, Clara Pölzl, was the exact opposite of her husband. Sweet and submissive, her life revolved around the well-being of her family. According to documents and testimonies, Clara was likely Alois's second cousin, a relationship that required a special dispensation from the Catholic Church for marriage. This blood relationship was not unusual in those rural regions, where families tended to intermarry to preserve property and connections. Adolf was one of 6 children born to the couple, but only he and his younger sister Paula survived beyond infancy. High infant mortality was a cruel reality at the time, and the successive deaths of his siblings imprinted in Hitler an early familiarity with loss and grief. The most tragic death was that of his brother Otto, born in 1892, who suffered from hydrocephalus and died a few days after birth. Some experts believe this personal tragedy may have unconsciously instilled in Hitler certain ideas about racial purity and a rejection of disabilities. The relationship between Adolf and his father was always contentious. Alois wanted a secure career as a civil servant for his son, while Adolf dreamed of becoming an artist. At an early age, he displayed an intense passion for drawing and painting, hobbies his father dismissed as pointless. This clash of wills fueled resentment and rebellion in young Adolf, whose frustrations grew as Alois's health deteriorated. The death of his father in 1903, when Adolf was just 14, was a turning point. Freed from his father's strict discipline, Hitler attempted to pursue his artistic calling by moving to Vienna, where he sought admission to the prestigious Academy of Fine Arts. However, his aspirations were cut short when he was twice rejected because his drawings were deemed to lack talent. His pride wounded, and without a clear direction, Hitler wandered around Vienna, barely surviving, while his ideas on nationalism, anti-Semitism, and social resentment began to take shape. In contrast, his bond with his mother, Clara, was deeply affectionate. She represented his only emotional refuge. When Clara became seriously ill with breast cancer in 1907, Hitler was by her side, caring for her until her final moments. His mother's death devastated him so much that, according to witnesses, he fell into a deep depression. In the words of Clara's own attending physician, Dr. Eduard Bloch, an Austrian Jew who would later be personally protected by Hitler himself, "I have never seen anyone more despondent over the death of a mother." Clara's departure, Adolf Hitler was left alone in the world, with no close family to support him emotionally beyond his younger sister Paula, whose relationship with him would become more distant over the years. In this landscape of early loss, artistic frustrations, and growing emotional isolation, the personality of a man began to take shape who, in a few decades, would be remembered not for his paintings but for the horror he would unleash upon the world. Schicklgruber, Hitler family, secrets and scandals. Behind every famous name, no matter how infamous, lies a family legacy, often filled with secrets, conflicts, and silences. The surname Hitler, which resonates throughout history as a synonym for horror, wasn't always that way. And the story of how it came about, as well as of those who bore it, is a fascinating testament to the murky origins of one of the most controversial figures of the 20th century. The story begins with Maria Anna Schicklgruber, Adolf Hitler's paternal grandmother. She was a lower-class peasant woman in the small village of Strons in the Waldviertel region of Austria. In 1837, Maria Anna gave birth to an illegitimate boy whom she named Alois. The countryside was rife with gossip about the identity of the father, but birth records left a blank space. From this uncertain origin would sprout an entire family tree that, over time, some would try to hide. For decades, Alois bore his mother's surname, Schicklgruber. It was only in later life that, for reasons that are still debated, he applied for legitimation of his birth through his stepfather, Johann Georg Hitler. Curiously, it was not Hitler who signed the documents, but a priest and 3 witnesses. Later, when registering his surname, Alois made, or perhaps chose, a transcription error. Hitler became Hitler. Some historians suggest this change was no accident. At the time, having a sonorous, short and Germanic surname could open doors in the Imperial Customs Service. Schicklgruber sounded rural, coarse, and associated with poor peasants. Hitler, on the other hand, seemed short, military, and authoritarian. Thus, bureaucratically, a name was born destined to remain sealed in the darkest annals of humanity. Alois Hitler's youth was marked by his pursuit of respect and social advancement. He joined the customs service as an apprentice and, thanks to his ambition and dedication, rose through the ranks to become an inspector. However, his personal life was anything but exemplary. He married 3 times and had countless extramarital affairs. His first wife was Anna Glasl-Höre, an older woman, sick and childless. After her death, Alois wasted no time. He married his young lover, Franziska Matzelsberger, who was already pregnant. This marriage produced 2 well-known children, Alois Hitler Jr. in 1882 and Angela Hitler in 1883. The happiness of this new union was short-lived. Franziska died young of tuberculosis, leaving Alois a widower again. He soon found solace in Clara Pölzl, a young woman who had worked as a servant in his house and who was also his second-degree niece, or perhaps his direct niece, according to interpretations of genealogical records. The closeness of blood between Alois and Clara did not go unnoticed. They required a papal dispensation to marry, a procedure that demonstrates how necessary it was. Justify this union before the Church. In January 1885, the marriage was finally blessed, although fraught with murmurs and rumors. From the marriage between Alois and Clara, but fate was cruel. Only Adolf and Paula would survive childhood. The illnesses and sanitary conditions of the time took a heavy toll, leaving a tragic mark on the young Adolf that, according to some historical psychoanalysts, may have influenced his harsh and fatalistic worldview. Life in the Hitler household was harsh. Alois, now older and increasingly irascible, took out his frustration on his children, particularly Adolf, whom he failed to mold according to his rigid view of duty and obedience. Often, the neighbors of Leonding, the town where they lived, commented on the screams and blows emanating from the family home. In contrast, Clara was a balm for his children. Adolf was said to be especially attached to his mother, who affectionately called him Adi. The premature loss of siblings, The father's violence and his adoration for his mother were the first pieces of the complex emotional puzzle that would characterize Hitler in his adult life. After Alois's death in 1903, the family was left financially vulnerable. Despite the pension they received, difficulties soon began to set in. Adolf unsuccessfully attempted to enter the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna, while Paula, still a child, remained in the care of her mother until her death in 1907. Meanwhile, Adolf's half-siblings followed very different paths. Alois Hitler Jr., Zrenia, his older half-brother, was a troubled young man. He rebelled against his father, left home at an early age, and after wandering around Europe, eventually emigrated to Ireland, where he married Bridget Dowling. He later returned to Germany, where his relationship with his half-brother Adolf became strained and opportunistic. For her part, Angela Hitler maintained a closer relationship with Adolf. During the future Führer's years of political ascent, Angela worked for him at the Berghof residence, and although their bond would be overshadowed by the tragedy of her daughter Gaili, she continued to have access to the inner circle of Nazi power until the mid-1930s. No less intriguing is the case of the rumors of Jewish ancestry surrounding Hitler's family. One theory held that his paternal grandfather was a Jew named Leopold Frankenberger, but modern historians almost unanimously dismiss it. There is no serious documentary evidence, and by the time Alois was born, Jews had been expelled from that region of Austria. Still, the mere existence of this rumor illustrates how complex and rarefied was the perception of the genealogy of the man who would later drive the ideology of racial purity. Hitler's family tree, therefore, is a miniature portrait of Central Europe at the time, rural, full of secrets, struggles for social advancement, untimely deaths, and a heavy emotional legacy. Nothing in that lineage foreshadowed the storm one of his descendants would unleash on the world. Every tragedy, every frustrated ambition, every unspoken silence in that family would, in some way, be part of the breeding ground for a future dictator. Paula Hitler, the silent sister. Amid the chaos and horror surrounding the name Hitler, there is one figure who has remained in the shadows of history: Paula Hitler, the dictator's younger sister. Her life, almost unknown to the general public, was a path of discretion, resignation, and a loyalty that is difficult to understand. A woman who, although related by blood to one of the most hated men in human history, chose to remain on the sidelines, observing the great events of her time from a nearly invisible corner. Paula Hitler was born on January 21, 1896, in Haarfeld, Austria, 7 years after Adolf Hitler. She was the last child of Alois Hitler and Clara Pölzl, who had already lost several young children. From the moment she was born, Paula represented a small hope for her parents, especially Clara, who showered her with renewed tenderness and maternal love. As a child, Paula witnessed a home marked by tension and severity. Her elderly father was even more authoritarian and less patient than he had been when he raised his other children. Her brother Adolf, significantly older, was an imposing figure for her. Someone she saw not only as a brother but almost as a second father figure in her youth. Paula's childhood memories of Adolf are few but revealing. In one of the few surviving testimonies, Paula recounted, "When we played Red Indians, my brother Adolf was always the leader. Everyone else did what he said. His will was stronger than ours." These words, though simple, encapsulate a crucial characteristic of the future dictator: his instinctive need for leadership, his determination to impose his will from an early age. Paula's childhood was inevitably marked by family tragedies. At the age of 7, she suffered the loss of her father. And just 4 years later, in 1907, her mother Clara died of breast cancer. For Paula, this double loss was devastating. Adolf, who by then was already trying to establish himself in Vienna, distanced himself from his sister, and the ties between them began to cool. After her mother's death, Paula lived for a time with various relatives and friends, while Adolf wandered around Vienna and then Munich, trying unsuccessfully to make his way as an artist. Letters between the siblings are few and far between. The geographical and emotional separation seemed insurmountable. It was in 1921, after more than a decade of estrangement, that the siblings were reunited. By then, Adolf Hitler was already a rising political agitator, leader of the nascent National Socialist German Workers' Party. However, their relationship never became intimate again. Adolf viewed Paula more as a potential liability than an ally. He feared that her public presence could be exploited by his political enemies. In 1930, he advised his sister to change her surname to Wolf, a pseudonym he himself occasionally used, to protect her from unwanted attention. Paula agreed, and from then on she worked under that name in various offices and insurance companies. During the height of the Nazi regime, Paula led a discreet existence. She did not participate in politics, held public office, or enjoy any notable privileges. She lived modestly with office jobs that barely allowed her to sustain herself. However, she maintained sporadic contact with her brother, and there is no doubt that she continued to feel a certain personal loyalty toward him. The breaking point in their relationship came in 1941. Paula informed Adolf that she was engaged to an army officer, Ernst Wiegels. For the young woman, it was a chance to escape loneliness and start a family. However, Hitler, obsessed with controlling his family image, forbade the marriage. He ordered Wiegels's arrest and his dispatch to the Eastern Front, where he would die in a Soviet prison camp. This act forever severed any affection Paula might have felt for her brother. Although there was no public rift or declaration of dissent, privately Paula never forgave him. When the Third Reich fell in 1945, Paula was arrested by US forces. She was detained, interrogated, and her property was confiscated. During her interrogation, she defended Adolf's memory, stating that she couldn't believe her brother had ordered atrocities like the Holocaust. In her words, "I couldn't conceive of it." The Allies, after deeming Paula to have played no active role in the regime's crimes, released her. Without resources, without family, and burdened by the burden of her family name, Paula returned to a modest life, first in Vienna and then in various German cities. He survived thanks to small administrative jobs and the charity of sympathetic friends. Finally, in 1952, he settled in Berchtesgaden, the same region where his brother had had his Alpine retreat. Paula Hitler died on June 1, 1960, in complete anonymity under the name Paula Wolf. She was buried in a discreet cemetery without monuments or honors, carrying with her secrets that she never fully revealed. Her life is a testament to how a family name can be an unbearable burden. Although she committed no crimes, nor did she actively defend the regime, the weight of being Hitler's sister denied her any chance of a normal existence. Like a silent shadow in the history, Paula Hitler represents a tragic and forgotten figure caught between sisterly love, disappointment, and horror. Perfect. Let's move on then, now delving into the story of Hitler's half-siblings, characters who add even more murky nuances to this family tale. The half-siblings, Alois Jr. and Angela. Adolf Hitler was not an only child even within his immediate family. Along with his sister Paula, Adolf shared blood ties, albeit more distant, with two half-siblings born from his father Alois's previous marriages, Alois Hitler Jr. and Angela Hitler. The story of these two figures, marked by ambition, tragedy, and emotional distance, offers a fascinating window into the family environment that surrounded the future Führer. Alois Hitler Jr. was born in 1882, the fruit of Alois Sr.'s second marriage to Franziska Matzelsberger. From childhood, Alois Jr. was a constant source of trouble. Rebellious, unruly, and with a volatile temper, he never managed to meet his father's strict expectations. The relationship between father and son deteriorated rapidly. For Alois Jr., the family home, marked by rigid discipline and absolute authority, was an unbearable prison. He soon left home as a teenager, virtually severing all ties with his family. His later life was erratic. He worked as a waiter and cook in various Austrian and German cities. In his search for independence and fortune, Alois Jr. eventually emigrated to the United Kingdom in the early 20th century. There he met Bridget Dowling, a young Irish woman from a well-to-do family whom he married in 1909 without the approval of his father or the young woman's family. In 1911, Bridget gave birth to William Patrick Hitler, the son who, decades later, would shake the foundations of the family legacy. However, Alois Jr. and Bridget's union was brief and stormy. Alois abandoned his wife and child during World War I, returning to Germany where he rebuilt his life, this time with another woman, Hedwig Heidemann, with whom she had another son, Heinz Hitler, born in 1920. During the years of his half-brother Adolf's rise to power, Alois Jr. attempted to take advantage of his kinship. He established a luxury restaurant in Berlin, frequented by members of the Nazi Party, discreetly using the prestige of his surname, although taking care not to attract too much public attention. After the collapse of the Third Reich, Alois Jr. knew how to move intelligently. He changed his surname to Hitler, a barely perceptible but effective alteration, and avoided serious legal consequences. He lived quietly in Hamburg until his death in 1956, a death dull for a man whose life was marked by opportunism and family estrangement. The story of Angela Hitler, born in 1883, is different, marked by an initial closeness with Adolf that, however, would also end up spoiled by personal tragedies and mutual distrust. Angela was the daughter of Alois Hitler and Franziska Matzelsberger. Like Alois Jr., unlike her brother, Angela led a relatively stable life in her youth. She married Leo Raubal Sr. in 1903, with whom she had 3 children, Leo Jr., Angela Maria, Geli, Raubal, and Elfriede Raubal. Angela's stability was shattered in 1910 by the premature death of her husband. As a widow, she worked hard to support her children. Angela's figure would gain prominence years later when her half-brother Adolf began his meteoric political rise in Germany. In the 1920s, Adolf, now the leader of the NSDAP, sought to surround himself with people he trusted completely. Angela was called to work at the Berghof, Hitler's alpine retreat in Bavaria. There she oversaw the cooking, cleaning, and household chores, ensuring that the Führer's private environment was free of undesirable elements. This family bond wasn't just practical. Adolf trusted Angela more than most of his political collaborators. However, this relationship suffered an irreparable blow with the Geli tragedy. Raubal, Angela's daughter, young, attractive, and intelligent, Geli became the object of her uncle Adolf's deep affection and perhaps an unhealthy passion. His death in 1931 officially ruled a suicide, left indelible scars on both Angela and Adolf. Angela blamed her half-brother for the pressure and suffocating control he exerted over Geli, though she never publicly denounced him. After the Geli incident, Angela distanced herself from Adolf's inner circle. In 1936, she remarried, this time to an architect named Martin Hamich, and withdrew from political and public life. He lived the rest of his life in relative obscurity. He died in 1949, just 4 years after the end of the war, in a destroyed and divided Germany. The destinies of Alois Jr. and Angela Hitler illustrate 2 different paths that started from the same origin. Alois sought to exploit his family name opportunistically and selfishly, failing to develop a genuine bond with his more famous half-brother. Angela, on the other hand, was closer to Adolf emotionally, until personal tragedy forced her to withdraw and live with the weight of a past she could no longer change. In both cases, as with so many members of the Hitler family, the surname they shared became a curse, a constant reminder of a legacy impossible to cleanse or ignore. William Patrick Hitler, the nephew rebel. Among the lesser-known but most fascinating stories surrounding Adolf Hitler, the life of his nephew stands out, William Patrick Hitler. A man who, in a twist almost worthy of a tragic novel, not only distanced himself from the dictator but ended up fighting him during World War II. His story is one of an unusual family rebellion, marked by opportunism, disappointment, and, ultimately, direct confrontation. William Patrick Hitler was born on March 12, 1911, in Liverpool, England. His father was Alois Hitler Jr., component placement the half-brother of Adolf Hitler, and his mother was Bridget Dowling, a young Irish woman of good family. William grew up in modest but respectable surroundings, away from the direct influence of his uncle. During his childhood, Adolf Hitler was not yet a historical figure. He was simply Uncle Adolf, a distant relative living in Austria whose name barely resonated in the ears of a young British man. However, everything changed in the 1920s when Adolf Hitler began to rise in German politics. Prompted by growing news of his uncle's notoriety, and perhaps also by the promise of opportunity, William Patrick moved to Germany in 1933, shortly after Hitler's appointment as Chancellor. At first, he sought to profit from his family name. Using his kinship, he managed to obtain various well-paying jobs in banks, automobile factories, and companies affiliated with the Nazi regime. Adolf, although wary, initially agreed to help him, fearing that any family scandal could be used against him by his political enemies. However, he soon realized that William was ambitious and unpredictable. When William realized that the opportunities he was receiving in Germany were not sufficient for his ambition, he resorted to blackmail. He threatened to reveal embarrassing details about his uncle's family and past if he was not granted better positions or more money. Hitler, furious and suspicious, devised a plan. He offered him a more responsible position if he renounced his British citizenship. William, sensing a trap, refused. He feared that once he lost his British citizenship, he would be trapped in Germany under his uncle's control. Seeing that his position was becoming dangerous, he fled Germany in 1938 and returned to England. From there, he attempted to capitalize on his family history by writing newspaper articles such as "Why Do I Hate My Uncle?" and giving public lectures in which he recounted his personal experience with the Nazi regime. When World War II broke out, William Patrick was in a peculiar position. He was British, the son of a German father, and the nephew of Britain's greatest enemy. He was neither welcome nor trusted in England and feared for his safety. In 1939, he emigrated with his mother to the United States, seeking to start a new life. In America, William decided to take a radical step. He asked President Franklin D. Roosevelt for permission to enlist in the American Army and fight against his own uncle. In a gesture of confidence and propaganda, Roosevelt approved the request. William Patrick Hitler enlisted in the United States Navy in 1944. He served honorably during the war, participating in campaigns in the Pacific Theater. During his service, he was wounded and received the prestigious Purple Heart, a decoration awarded to soldiers wounded in combat. At the end of the war, William realized he couldn't live with the surname Hitler in the United States. The mere mention of the name evoked hatred and suspicion. He legally changed his name to William Patrick Stewart Houston, trying to leave behind the heavy legacy of his blood. He settled in Patchogue, a small town on Long Island, New York, where he led a quiet and discreet life. He married a German woman named Phyllis, and together they had 4 sons: Alexander, Louis, Howard, and Brian. Curiously, his descendants have lived in complete anonymity, refusing to be interviewed or appear in public. In fact, for years a rumor circulated that William's children had agreed not to have children so that the Hitler bloodline would voluntarily die out. Although never officially confirmed, the pact is part of the modern legends surrounding this branch of the family. William Patrick Hitler died in 1987, aged 76, after a life marked by his attempt to redeem himself from the burden of his surname. His life is a powerful testament to the fact that even within the most infamous family, a spark of resistance can emerge. While Adolf Hitler left a legacy of death and destruction, his nephew William chose a different path: to fight against tyranny and try to build a dignified life in a free world. Amidst the ominous shadow of Nazism, William Patrick was, in a way, a beacon of silent rebellion, a reminder that blood does not always determine destiny. Geli Raubal, Forbidden Love. If there is an episode in the personal life of Adolf Hitler that is tinged with mystery, obsession, and tragedy, it is undoubtedly his relationship with Geli Raubal. This story, often overlooked in the grand narratives of World War II, offers an intimate and deeply disturbing glimpse into the character of the future dictator. Angela Hitler, Adolf's half-sister, had 3 children from her marriage to Leo Raubal Mr. Among them, Angela stood out. Maria Raubal, known as Geli, was born in 1908. From a young age, Geli was described as a lively, intelligent, strong-willed, and very beautiful young woman, attributes that did not go unnoticed by her famous uncle. When Adolf Hitler began to gain notoriety in Munich's political circles during the 1920s, he decided it was his personal duty to oversee Geli's education. In 1925, following the death of her father, Geli moved in with Adolf in his apartment in the Bavarian city, officially to study medicine at the University of Munich. However, her life there was far from that of a normal young university student. Adolf, who by then had a solid structure within the National Socialist Party, exercised absolute and iron control over Geli. He isolated her from the outside world, monitored her friendships, prohibited certain contacts, and regulated her behavior almost as if she were his private property. This control wasn't merely protective, it was obsessive, possessive, and emotionally suffocating. Rumors about the nature of their relationship quickly spread. Many in the Führer's inner circle believed Adolf was deeply in love with his niece, a love that wasn't necessarily merely platonic. There are records that he forbade Gailey from having boyfriends, that he accompanied her everywhere, and that he even interrupted any potential romantic relationship she attempted. In public, Hitler referred to Gailey as his treasure, and she, although enjoying certain material privileges, seemed increasingly desperate to escape that gilded prison. Tragedy struck on September 18, 1931. Gailey Raubal was found dead in Hitler's Munich apartment with a gunshot wound to the chest. The pistol belonged to Adolf. The authorities quickly closed the case, declaring it a suicide, although the circumstances were, and remain, highly suspicious. Some witnesses claimed to have heard violent arguments between Adolf and Gailey days before her death. Others maintained that Gailey was planning to flee to Vienna to marry a young musician, something Hitler would never have tolerated. The speed with which the investigation was closed, coupled with Hitler's growing political influence, fueled rumors of a cover-up. Alternative versions hold that Gailey may have been murdered in a fit of rage, or that, driven to the limit by psychological oppression, she took her own life. Whatever the truth, the impact on Hitler was devastating. For weeks, Hitler fell into a deep depression. He withdrew from public life, wept inconsolably, and many of those close to him claimed he was never the same again. His relationships with women after Gailey, especially with Eva Brown, were marked by emotional coldness and an inability to form healthy bonds. For Hitler, Gailey represented more than just a niece or a forbidden love. She was the embodiment of an unattainable ideal of purity, beauty, and immaculate youth that, once lost, left him emotionally stagnant. Curiously, even in his last days in the Berlin bunker in 1945, when the world he had built was crumbling around him, Hitler kept on his desk a portrait of Gailey Raubal. Not even the presence of Eva Brown, whom he would marry just hours before his suicide, could replace that lost figure in his memory. Gailey's story, Raubal, is one of the darkest episodes in Hitler's life because it reveals the intimate side of his personality, his obsession, his unhealthy need for control, his inability to accept the independence of others, and the seeds of the destructive violence he would later apply on a global scale. Gailey was an early victim of this relentless temper, and her death, though overshadowed by the horrors to come, marks one of the most critical moments in the development of the monster Hitler would eventually become. A forbidden love, a broken life, a tragedy that in a way foreshadowed the catastrophe that Adolf Hitler would unleash upon the entire world. Eva Brown, the last companion. If in the history of Adolf Hitler, Gailey Raubal represents the obsessive love of youth, Eva Brown personifies the resigned companionship of the last dark years. Her figure, often reduced to a superficial shadow behind the dictator, deserves to be analyzed in all its complexity. She was not simply a lover, but a woman caught between fanaticism, loyalty, and a desperate need for affection. Eva Anna Paula Brown was born on February 6, 1912, in Munich into a wealthy middle-class family. Her father, a schoolteacher, and her mother, a homemaker, provided her with a conventional education. As a young woman, Eva dreamed of a glamorous life. She loved photography, fashion, and film magazines. She longed for a very different existence from the monotonous reality of interwar Germany. At just 17, she began working as an assistant and model for Heinrich Hoffmann, the official photographer of the Nazi Party. It was in Hoffmann's studio that she first met Adolf Hitler, a man 23 years her senior and already a prominent figure in German politics. Gailey's death, Raubal maintained a considerable emotional distance. For Eva, however, Hitler was fascinating, a powerful, charismatic man who promised a life unlike anything she had ever known. The relationship developed in the shadows. Hitler, conscious of his public image, strove to keep his private life away from the spotlight. Presenting himself as a man married only to Germany was part of his political construct. As a result, Eva Brown lived years of solitude in a strange limbo. She was his partner in private, but could not be officially recognized. This emotional marginalization had a devastating price. In 1932, just 3 years after they met, Eva attempted suicide with a gunshot to the chest. It was not a fatal attempt, but the message was clear. The young woman was willing to do anything to be taken into account. Far from pushing her away, Hitler strengthened his bond with her after the incident. He granted her a series of privileges, access to the Berghof, personal attention, and expensive gifts, but he continued to keep her out of the public eye. Eva Brown then understood that to remain at Hitler's side, she must accept a subordinate and clandestine role. The relationship settled into a peculiar pattern. Eva settled into the Berghof residence, where she enjoyed certain luxuries and the company of a small circle of friends, many of them members of Hitler's personal entourage. She spent her days taking photographs, cycling, skiing, and participating in carefully orchestrated social events. Her life, although materially comfortable, was marked by profound emotional isolation. Hitler visited her irregularly, more concerned with state affairs and the war than with his romantic relationship. In 1935, Eva attempted suicide again, this time by taking an overdose of sleeping pills. Again she survived, and once again Hitler reinforced his informal commitment to her, ensuring that her loyalty would not waver. Despite these episodes, Eva Brown never intervened in politics. She didn't participate in the regime's decisions, meetings, or conspiracies. She remained a silent companion, completely removed from the terror the Nazi regime unleashed in Europe. As the war progressed and the Third Reich began to collapse, Eva remained loyal to Hitler. When it became clear that defeat was inevitable, she decided to join him in the Chancellery bunker in the heart of Berlin. There, in an oppressive atmosphere, surrounded by the imminent defeat, Hitler and Eva were married on April 29, 1945, in an austere and almost desperate ceremony. After the wedding, they shared a modest wedding meal with their closest friends. On April 30, 1945, just one day after their wedding, Adolf Hitler and Eva Brown ended their lives. Hitler shot himself in the head, while Eva chose to poison herself with cyanide. Their bodies were burned in the garden of the Chancellery to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. Eva Braun's death was the inevitable conclusion of a life lived in the shadow of a monster. Her existence, marked by the sacrifice of her identity, her freedom, and her personal happiness, is one of the most tragic among the supporting characters in the drama of the Third Reich. She was a woman who loved a man, not necessarily for his ideals, but for his power and personal magnetism. And for that love, she paid the highest possible price, the annulment of her individual life and ultimately her death. In the years following the war, Eva Brown's figure would be the subject of multiple interpretations. For some, a naive victim. For others, a silent accomplice. In any case, her story demonstrates that Hitler's inner circle was composed not only of powerful men, but also of souls trapped in the web of fanaticism and submission. The lost descendants, Otto, Heinz, and Leo Raubal. When talking about Adolf Hitler's family, the focus often falls on figures like his sister Paula or his nephew William Patrick. However, there are other lesser-known names, relatives who, although much less famous, were also swept up in the devastating currents of the 20th century. Otto Hitler, Heinz Hitler, and Leo Raubal. Junior, 3 different lives, 3 tragic destinies, which illuminate other facets of the dark family legacy. Otto Hitler is perhaps the most tragically short-lived member of the Hitler family tree. He was born in 1892 to Alois Hitler and Clara. Pulsel, however, Otto came into the world suffering from hydrocephalus, a serious congenital malformation that in those days was almost always an early death sentence. Little Otto lived only 6 days. Her existence is almost a footnote in the family's history, but her death was not insignificant. The tragedy left a deep emotional wound in Clara, Adolf's mother, who had already suffered other childhood losses. For Adolf, who was barely 3 years old at the time, the impact is difficult to measure. Some historians speculate that this early confrontation with illness and death may have subconsciously influenced his later views on racial purity and his utter contempt for people with physical and mental disabilities. Euthanasia programs against the disabled under the policy known as Action T4, which justified the elimination of lives unworthy of life. A macabre irony, considering that his own younger brother had been a natural victim of the very conditions he would later systematically condemn to death. Otto Hitler, the forgotten child, is in a way the first silent witness to a fanaticism that was still in gestation. Heinz Hitler, born in 1920, was the son of Alois Hitler Jr. and his second wife, Hedwig Heidemann. Unlike his half-brother William Patrick, who would renounce his family ties, Heinz was a fervent follower of his uncle Adolf. Educated in elite schools designed to train the future generation of Nazi leaders, Heinz became the regime's model nephew. He was disciplined, devout, and a firm believer in National Socialist ideology. With the outbreak of war, Heinz joined the Heer, the regular German army, as a signals officer. He took part in Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, one of the most brutal campaigns in military history. However, his loyalty did not guarantee his survival. In 1942, during a mission on the Eastern Front, Heinz was captured by Soviet forces. In Soviet prisoner of war camps, where conditions were inhumane, Heinz suffered ill treatment and torture. According to records, he died shortly after his capture at the age of 22. The official version speaks of death due to illness or ill treatment, although the exact circumstances remain unclear. Thus ended the life of a young man who had fully embraced the Nazi ideology. His death, at the hands of those his uncle had declared his mortal enemies, is another sad twist in the history of the Hitler family. Leo Raubal Jr., component placement, born in 1906, was the son of Angela Hitler, Adolf's half-sister, and Leo Raubal, Mr. Unlike Heinz or William Patrick. Leo was apolitical, a dedicated academic, working as a chemistry teacher in the city of Salzburg before the outbreak of war. However, family status inevitably caught up with him. As the war spread, Leo was drafted in 1939, like many young men of his generation. He served in the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, as a technical officer. His fate would take a dramatic turn in January 1943 during the Battle of Stalingrad, one of the bloodiest engagements of World War II. There, Leo was wounded and later captured by the Red Army. During interrogation, his identity and relationship to Adolf Hitler were revealed, although they initially failed to impress his captors. The Soviets later realized the potential propaganda value of holding the Führer's nephew. A prisoner exchange was even proposed, Leo Raubal in exchange for Yakov Djugashvili, the son of Joseph Stalin, who had also been taken prisoner by the Germans. Stalin, however, rejected the exchange outright, coldly declaring, "I don't trade soldiers for generals." Thus, Leo Raubal Jr. became trapped in the Soviet Gulag system, spending more than 12 years in inhumane conditions. He wouldn't be released until 1955, following a general amnesty for prisoners of war. He emerged from the labor camps a man profoundly weakened physically and mentally. Leo spent his final years in Austria, living a discreet life away from politics. He died in 1977, a victim of complications from the tuberculosis he had contracted in the Gulag. 3 names, 3 forgotten stories. Otto, Heinz, and Leo represent the small tragedies within the great tragedy. They were not public figures, they signed no treaties, nor did they commit atrocities. However, their lives were irrevocably marked by the weight of a surname that linked them to a historical catastrophe not of their own choosing. In them, we see the human side of the story, the relatives of monsters, often trapped with no escape between stigma, fanaticism, and destruction. A Jewish Hitler, myths and realities. Few rumors have persisted as strongly in modern history as the theory that Adolf Hitler, the architect of the 20th century's most devastating systematic anti-Semitism, had Jewish origins. The paradox is tantalizing. Could the man who carried out the Holocaust have had Jewish blood? Over the decades, this hypothesis has been debated, investigated, and largely discredited. But its very existence reveals as much about the anxieties of the past as it does about the complexity of Hitler's familial origins. The best-known version of this theory holds that Hitler's paternal grandfather was a Jew named Leopold Frankenberger, a resident of Graz in the Styria region of Austria. According to this narrative, Maria Anna Schicklgruber, Hitler's paternal grandmother, would have worked as a servant in the home of the Frankenberger family and would have become pregnant with a young member of that family. The story gained popularity thanks to the testimony of Hans Frank, one of the Nazi jurists closest to Hitler, who, in his confessions before being executed in Nuremberg, stated that he had investigated the Führer's origins and had found this possible connection. However, solid historical evidence to support this claim is at best non-existent. First, at the time Maria Anna Schicklgruber would have conceived Alois, Hitler's future father, there was no documentary evidence of Jewish families living in Graz. Jews had been expelled from Styria in 1496 by imperial order and were not officially allowed to return until the 19th century, well after the date in question. By the time Maria Anna gave birth in 1837, there were no legal records of Jews residing there. Second, there is no documentary evidence of the existence of a Leopold Frankenberger in Graz at that time. There are no census, tax records, or parish archives to support this claim. In fact, most serious Austrian researchers consider Hans Frank's account highly suspect, possibly a product of his desperate attempt to justify his own collaborationist behavior after the fall of the Third Reich. Third, even the most critical historians of Hitler, such as Ian Kershaw and Joachim Fest, dismiss the hypothesis as unfounded. Both maintain that Hitler's lineage was, in ethnic terms, typically German, Austrian, and Catholic, with no verifiable traces of Jewish ancestry. So where does the persistence of this theory come from? Part of the answer lies in Hitler's own insecurity about his genealogy. From early in his political career, he was extremely sensitive to any investigation into his family history. He personally commissioned private investigations to ensure that his Aryan Germanic ancestry was unimpeachable. Furthermore, gaps in the birth records, such as the fact that his father, Alois, was illegitimate, brought fertile ground for speculation. In a regime that based its legitimacy on racial purity, any ambiguity about the Supreme Leader's origins was potentially devastating. Therefore, considerable effort was expended to reinforce Hitler's image as a perfect son of Germany, even if this required omitting or reinterpreting uncomfortable facts. Some historians also point out that Hitler, lacking strong family ties due to the death of his parents, the estrangement of his siblings, and his emotional orphanhood, was more vulnerable to constructing an absolutist political identity based on a racial fantasy to make up for personal uncertainty. Finally, we cannot ignore that the persistence of the Jewish Hitler theory serves a psychological function. It is a way of reconciling the inconceivable. To think that the greatest perpetrator of anti-Semitism could have had Jewish blood offers, for many, a kind of poetic justice or a symbolic explanation for the monstrosity of his crimes. However, history, relentless in its rigor, demonstrates that a biological contradiction is not necessary to explain hatred. The great crimes of humanity require not genetic paradoxes, but social structures, destructive ideologies, and conscious human decisions. In conclusion, serious historians agree that there is no evidence to support the hypothesis of a Jewish origin in Hitler's genealogy. The myth persists as a reflection of our need to understand the incomprehensible, but the facts, in this case, are clear. The horror of Nazism requires no further explanation than human brutality itself. The Hitler Epilogue, from Germany to America. The story of the Hitler family did not end with the fall of the Third Reich. While Adolf Hitler and his close circle disintegrated in the ruins of the Berlin bunker, their most distant relatives survived, scattered across a world that would never be the same again. Many of they, burdened with a cursed surname, embarked on paths of exile, anonymity, and in some cases, complete reinvention. Paula Hitler, Adolf's only biological sister, lived a shadowy existence after the war. After her capture and release by the Allied forces, she settled under the pseudonym Paula Wolf in a small village in Bavaria. Despite the weight of her surname, Paula steered clear of any political activity. She worked intermittently as a secretary and office clerk, surviving modestly with the help of loyal friends. She died in 1960, alone, without descendants or fortune. Her tomb is discreet, without grandiloquent epitaphs, as if even in death she had wanted to erase any trace linking her to the name that had so definitively marked her life. Adolf's half-brother, Alois Hitler Jr., Swing adopted the surname Hiller after the war to avoid reprisals. He lived in Hamburg, living discreetly until his death in 1956. Alois Jr. didn't leave a great legacy. His children, however, would be the ones to carry the heavy shadow of the lineage. William Patrick Hitler, as we saw, had emigrated to the United States before the outbreak of the war. After fighting heroically against the Nazi regime in the US Navy and receiving the Purple Heart, William realized that his surname was an insurmountable barrier in post-war American society. He then decided to legally change his name to William Patrick Stewart Houston. He settled in Patchogue, a small town on Long Island, New York, where he opened a modest medical analysis laboratory. He married a German woman, Phyllis, and had 4 sons, Alexander, Louis, Howard, and Brian. Throughout his life, William avoided all publicity. He rejected interviews, publishing contracts, and any attempts to exploit his family history. He wanted to protect his children from the burden of the family name and prevent his family from being associated with Adolf Hitler. He died in 1987, aged 76, after a life of conscious and deliberate anonymity. Of William Patrick's 4 children, none had any children. This fact fueled one of the most persistent rumors surrounding Hitler's later life, the so-called Pact of Silence. According to various sources, William's children had agreed not to have children to ensure that Adolf Hitler's bloodline would be permanently extinguished. Although it has never been publicly confirmed, given that the Stuart Houstons have maintained a strict media silence, the reality is that to this day there is no direct descendant of Adolf Hitler or his immediate family. Alexander Stuart Houston, the best known of the brothers, currently lives in New York, leading a life completely removed from any public exposure. This pact, if it really existed, represents a powerful symbolic decision, the conscious renunciation of perpetuating a lineage contaminated by history, a form of silent redemption in the face of the horrors of the past. Elfriede Raubal, Angela Hitler's youngest daughter, also chose anonymity after the war. She lived discreetly in Germany, away from the public eye until her death in 1993. Her son, about whom very little is known, is still alive, although his identity remains carefully protected. Meanwhile, other distant relatives simply diluted their ties to the surname, changing their names or adopting new identities in different parts of Europe. The fall of the Third Reich not only meant the end of a political regime, it also marked the complete disintegration of a family whose branches, once united by blood, were forever dispersed, marked by infamy, fear, and the unbearable weight of memory. Today, more than 80 years after the end of World War II, the surname Hitler has almost completely disappeared from the world. There is no lineage left to claim that name, nor any descendants seeking to perpetuate it. Only echoes remain of a history that still shocks the human conscience. The last secrets of the bunker. The final scene of Adolf Hitler's life wasn't fought on a majestic battlefield or in a courtroom. It unfolded in the dark bowels of Berlin in an underground bunker, while the world he had built with blood and fire crumbled irrevocably around him. The Führer bunker, located some 8 meters underground behind the Reich Chancellery, was the last refuge of the dictator and his inner circle. With reinforced concrete walls over 4 meters thick, it was designed as an emergency shelter, but in the final days of World War II, it became an early grave. In April 1945, Berlin lay in ruins. Allied bombing and the Soviet offensive had turned the city into a hell of fire and rubble. However, inside the bunker, reality seemed to alternate between resignation, hopelessness, and pathological denial. Hitler, physically deteriorating, with tremors in his left hand and his health severely affected by medication and stress, maintained an almost theatrical routine: brief military meetings, dictation of useless documents, frugal meals, and long walks through the grey corridors. Around him, his entourage tried to maintain a normality that was already impossible. Eva Brown, his faithful companion, organized small parties, smoked, something Hitler hated, and tried to inject some artificial joy into the atmosphere, aware that the end was inevitable. There was also Joseph and Magda Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda minister, and his wife, who had brought their 6 young children to the bunker, in an act of fanatical loyalty that would culminate in one of the most macabre scenes in modern history. On the evening of April 29, 1945, Adolf Hitler and Eva Brown were married in a small ceremony inside the bunker. The event was brief, somber, and devoid of any hint of genuine celebration. The judge who officiated at the wedding, Walter Wagner, later recalled that Hitler looked gaunt and distant. They signed the legal documents in the presence of Joseph Goebbels and Martin Bormann as witnesses. That same night, Hitler dictated his political testament, in which he designated Karl Dönitz as his successor as Reich president and bitterly condemned traitors such as Heinrich Himmler and Hermann Göring, who had attempted to negotiate surrender with the Allies behind his back. In his private will, Hitler acknowledged his marriage to Eva and requested that both be cremated after his death to prevent their bodies from being displayed as trophies. On the morning of April 30th, 1945, Hitler and Eva Brown had breakfast together. Sometime after lunch, they said goodbye to their closest entourage. In a small private room in the bunker, Hitler shot himself in the head while Eva Brown swallowed a cyanide capsule. When their bodies were found, the aides, following Hitler's prior instructions, took the bodies to the Chancellery garden, doused them with gasoline, and set them on fire. As the flames consumed the newlyweds' remains, the Red Army advanced inexorably over the ruins of Berlin. Following the suicide of Hitler and Eva Brown, chaos ensued in the bunker. Joseph and Magda Goebbels, unable to imagine a world without the Führer, decided to end the lives of their 6 children by poisoning them while they slept. They then both committed suicide, Magda by swallowing poison, Joseph by shooting himself. Other staff members attempted to escape, but few succeeded. Many were captured by the Soviets, who interrogated them extensively about the final days of the Third Reich. Martin Bormann, Hitler's powerful private secretary, died trying to flee Berlin, although his body would not be identified until decades later. For years after the war, persistent rumors surfaced that Hitler had escaped from the bunker and fled to South America. The lack of immediate photographic evidence and the onset of the Cold War fueled all sorts of conspiracy theories. Subsequent investigations, both Soviet and Western, conclusively confirmed that Hitler died in the Berlin bunker. The skull and other remains found by the Soviets, as well as first-hand accounts from survivors, disproved the fantasies of his escape. There was no heroic escape, there was no hidden exile, only death, ashes and ruin beneath the ruins of their fallen empire. Hitler's end wasn't grand or epic, it was pathetic and brutal, locked underground, accompanied by the thunder of bombing and the collapse of everything he had fought for. It was a fitting end to a life built on lies, hatred and destruction. In the damp silence of the Berlin bunker, beneath the city crumbling above them, an era of horror that would change the course of history forever ended. The inescapable legacy, final reflections. The name Hitler did not dissolve in the flames that consumed his body on April 30th, 1945. Nor did it disappear with the German capitulation or the Nuremberg trials. Unlike so many other historical figures, his shadow extended beyond his time, contaminating future generations and persisting as a symbol of absolute evil. The legacy of Adolf Hitler is one of the heaviest that humanity has ever had to bear, not because he deserves any glorification, but because his memory acts as a brutal reminder of how far the human condition can go when hatred, intolerance, and the thirst for power meet no ethical or moral barriers. Analyzing Hitler's legacy requires going beyond the man himself. It's not enough to view him as an isolated monster. Hitler was the symptom of an era, a Europe torn apart by the First World War, humiliated, impoverished, and desperately seeking redemption. Hitler's rise was not a magic trick. It was the result of economic crises, national resentments, political manipulation, and a profound crisis of values in Western society. It was the product of a historical context that allowed a charismatic but destructive figure to capitalize on the fear, hatred, and hope of the masses. Therefore, his legacy is twofold. It is a testament to the horror that a single man can cause, but also a mirror in which all societies must look to recognize their darkest vulnerabilities. The vast majority of his surviving family members tried to erase the Hitler name from their lives. They changed their names, went into hiding, and lived in anonymity. Some, like William Patrick Hitler, actively fought against his own uncle's regime. Others simply disappeared from history, preferring oblivion to shame. The surname Hitler, once intended to sound strong, authoritarian, and Germanic, has become a universal synonym for evil. It's a name that has almost no bearers in today's world, a surname voluntarily extinguished by those who, even through no fault of their own, refused to perpetuate its legacy of horror. This phenomenon, that of an entire family disappearing by choice or necessity, has almost no parallel in modern history. It speaks to the immensity of the collective trauma that Nazism left behind. Over time, another disturbing phenomenon emerged, the trivialization of evil. As the years passed, Hitler's name began to appear in films, TV series, parodies, and internet memes. He became an almost caricature-like figure in certain contexts, which, while it may be a form of symbolic disarmament from the horror, also runs the risk of trivializing it. Reducing Hitler to a joke or a bad joke is dangerous. Because it ignores the real pain, the lives cut short, the millions of deaths who fell victim to the ideas this man embodied. Historical memory demands that the name Hitler not be used lightly, that it be remembered not only as a symbol but as a warning. In modern Germany, the memory of the Third Reich is the subject of ongoing critical memory work. Monuments, museums, documents, and laws against Nazi apology seek to prevent the horror from recurring. Hitler's name and what he represents is taught in schools, not as a figure of greatness, but as a borderline case of moral corruption and civilizational catastrophe. Germany, perhaps more than any other nation, has made remembrance an instrument of civic education. The world as a whole faces the challenge of not forgetting, not because there is a risk of a new Hitler emerging identically. History never literally repeats itself, but because the conditions that made him possible, hatred, fanaticism, mass manipulation, continue to exist in different forms. Today, more than 8 decades after his death, Hitler remains the face of evil. Not a mystical or supernatural evil, but a tangible human evil, born of everyday choices, fears, and hatreds. His image persists in books, documentaries, and historical research. His mind, his environment, and his decisions are analyzed in a perpetual attempt to understand what often seems incomprehensible. How could modern civilization have sunk so low? And the answer is never simple. Because Hitler wasn't an isolated madman. He was a product of his time. A catalyst for dark forces that were already latent. The story of Hitler and his family, the collapse of the family name, the silent sacrifice of his descendants, the extinction of his lineage, all make up a tragic testimony that must not be forgotten. His life and his death should be remembered not out of morbid fascination, but as a lasting lesson. Civilization, democracy, human dignity are not natural states. They are fragile achievements that require constant defense. Hitler's shadow reminds us that history does not guarantee a path of progress, and that moral vigilance, compassion, and memory are the only weapons we have to prevent the ghosts of the past from returning to haunt us.